The wind carried with it a haunting melody, a cry that seemed to come not just from the storm, but from the earth itself, as if nature was pleading for something unseen. Snow lashed against the lonely ranch house like icy hands clawing for entry, while the world beyond was swallowed by white silence and shadows. Samuel Drake, a man hardened by years of solitude and toil, felt the weight of the storm pressing on his chest. His cabin stood like a stubborn beacon against the fury, but even he knew that in such a night survival was fragile, a delicate thread easily snapped by the merciless cold. He had just fastened the last shutter when it came, the sound that didn't belong to the storm, a pounding, urgent, desperate, a rhythm that carried through the gale like the beating of a frightened heart. It froze him in place, for no soul should have been wandering the plains at such an hour. Yet there it was again, accompanied by a voice trembling but unyielding, slicing through the roar of the wind. "I'm freezing. Let me in." That plea pierced through Samuel's guarded soul. He crossed the room swiftly, wrestled with the heavy door, and pulled it open against the storm's grasp. What met his eyes was a vision both tragic and beautiful. A young woman stood there, her long dark hair matted with ice, her lips pale and trembling, her garments torn by the merciless cold. And yet, within her eyes, flickered something fierce, something that refused to be broken. Pride burned there, mingling with desperation. A fragile dignity clung to like a lifeline. She staggered, nearly falling into his arms, whispering with chapped lips that promise of reward, a phrase spoken with urgency, as if it was the very breath keeping her alive. He didn't question her, didn't ask what brought her across the wilderness. Instead, with a firm yet gentle touch, he drew her inside, slamming the door against the night's fury. Warmth enveloped her in the glow of the hearth, a sudden shift so sharp it made her flinch as if the heat itself could wound. Samuel draped a heavy woolen blanket across her shoulders, and she clung to it with trembling hands, her body shuddering not just from cold, but from the weight of what she had endured. The fire crackled and spat, casting amber light across her face, a face weathered by wind, yet radiant with unspoken strength. She did not speak at first. Only the chattering of her teeth filled the silence as he poured steaming coffee into a battered mug and pressed it into her hands. Her fingers, stiff as twigs, curled around it, and she sipped slowly at first, then greedily, as if each drop carried life itself. Samuel watched in silence, the storm's howl fading into the background as his attention narrowed only to her. Outside, snow still fell like a veil across the plains, but inside, time seemed suspended between two strangers bound by circumstance, their breaths mingling in the warm glow of firelight. There was a gentleness in the moment, a quiet healing that went deeper than warmth alone. The world beyond their walls was chaos, but within this fragile sanctuary something tender stirred. He saw in her eyes not just exhaustion, but a hidden story, a sorrow tucked away, and a strength carved by survival. She was no lost wanderer. She was a flame carried through the storm, refusing to die. He felt it, the way one feels the spark of fate, and though his lips remained silent, his heart whispered of something rare, something precious that had stepped across his threshold. And as the night deepened, Samuel found himself staring into the fire, not because he feared it would die, but because he feared what might awaken within him. That soft pull, that quiet yearning already taking root. Outside, the wind raged on, but here, within the cocoon of warmth, a story had begun, fragile, mysterious, destined to leave its mark. Perhaps it was the storm that had delivered her, or perhaps it was fate, weaving lives together like threads of silver across the cold expanse of winter. If this tale stirs something gentle in your heart, if it offers you warmth in the coldness of the world, let your thoughts linger with me. Share a comment of what you feel, whisper your presence with a like, or let this healing story continue its journey by subscribing, so that together we keep alive the kind of love that survives even in the fiercest storm. The snow outside did not relent, and yet the silence between them was not emptiness. It was the beginning of a bond unspoken, and as Samuel leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly, he knew the night would change everything. The storm was only the doorway. What lay beyond was a tale yet untold, one that even the winds could not carry away. The storm pressed against the ranch house with restless fingers, rattling every shutter, whispering through the smallest cracks, as though determined to remind them that outside still lay a world of fury and cold. Yet within those walls the hearth glowed like a heart, steady and unwavering, a fragile oasis of warmth in a land consumed by winter. Samuel sat across from the stranger, his broad shoulders hunched forward, his roughened hands wrapped loosely around a cup that had long since grown cold. His eyes, however, were not on the fire, but on her. She knelt close to the flames, her blanket drawn tightly, her profile bathed in shifting amber light. The sharp planes of her cheekbones seemed sculpted by hardship, her lips still faintly blue but firm, as if her spirit refused to show weakness even when her body had nearly betrayed her. Her name had not yet been spoken, and Samuel did not press for it. He knew enough of silence to recognize when words were a burden. Instead, he studied her carefully, allowing the quiet between them to stretch like a bridge slowly forming. The only sounds were the soft pop of the wood and the occasional whistle of wind against the chimney. She sipped the last of the coffee, her hands steadying, her shivers lessening. And when at last she set the mug aside, her gaze lifted to meet his, direct, unguarded, carrying the weight of something she had not yet spoken. "I was on my way to my people," she said finally, her voice still edged with the tremors of cold but underlined with strength. The words hung in the air between them, simple yet heavy, like stones placed carefully on sacred ground. Samuel felt an instinctive pull to ask her why she was alone, what danger had driven her into the storm, but he held his tongue. A man who had lived as he had, through seasons of drought, through the loneliness of endless plains, had learned patience. Sometimes a story unfolded like the thaw of winter, slowly, gently, at its own pace. He rose quietly, placing another log on the fire, watching sparks leap before settling into embers. She watched him too, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though weighing his measure not by his questions, but by his restraint. And in that glance there was the beginning of trust, not given easily, but tested, felt. She drew the blanket closer, tucking it around herself, and leaned nearer to the warmth, her posture softening, her breathing evening out. Samuel sat again, leaning back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment wash over him. He had spent countless nights listening to storms pass, each one blending into the next until time itself felt like an endless circle. But tonight was different. Tonight, within the fragile boundaries of his home, a stranger had entered, and with her something else, something unnamed but stirring, like the first green shoot pressing through frozen ground. The firelight danced across the walls, throwing shadows that seemed to tell their own stories. Her gaze lingered on them, lost in thought, before returning to him. "You'll have your answer when the storm clears," she murmured, her tone calm yet certain, not an apology, not a plea, but a statement rooted in her own will. Samuel felt a faint tug of admiration. This was not a woman broken by hardship. This was a woman carrying it like armor, her silence chosen, not forced. He nodded slowly, his voice steady. "You can rest here tonight." It was not an offer of charity, but of sanctuary, a simple truth spoken without expectation. Something in her eyes flickered then, gratitude, brief but real, before she turned her attention back to the flames. He retrieved an extra quilt, laying it gently across the couch by the hearth. She would sleep there, close to the fire, where the warmth could shield her from the echoes of the storm. The hours deepened, the wind outside waning into softer sighs, the snow still falling heavy across the plains. Samuel leaned into the back of his chair, his body weary, but his mind restless. He watched her eyelids grow heavy, her breathing slow into rhythm, her form curled beneath the layers of wool. In that stillness, something within him eased, as if the presence of another soul, fragile yet resilient, was itself a healing balm against the vast emptiness he had carried for years. Long into the night, as the fire dimmed into glowing coals, Samuel remained awake, listening to the storm retreat into the distance. Each crack of wood, each whistle of wind seemed less threatening now, as though the world outside had finally relented, granting them this small reprieve. He closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to savor the warmth of the moment, the delicate thread that had bound two paths together in the most unlikely of nights. And as dawn waited beyond the horizon, Samuel understood something wordless, that her arrival was no accident, no random plea for survival. It was the opening of a door fate had long prepared, the first page of a story neither of them could yet see, but one that would change them both in ways as deep and enduring as the winter sky. The morning came wrapped in silence, the kind of stillness that follows after a storm has spent its rage and left the land in surrender. Snow lay heavy across the plains, blanketing every fence post and field in white, softening the sharp edges of the world. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly like tired stars. Samuel stirred awake to the scent of ash and warmth lingering in the air, the leather of his chair creaking as he shifted. His eyes found her instantly, seated near the hearth, her figure outlined by the dim light of dawn. She was no longer trembling, no longer a woman desperate to survive the night, but something steadier, more composed. Her dark hair had dried, falling loose across her shoulders, and though her expression was guarded, her presence seemed less fragile, as though the fire had given her back a piece of her strength. She turned her gaze to him, her lips parting gently, and in a voice that carried quiet resilience, she offered her name. Tala. The syllables were soft but firm, like the rhythm of a drum carried from deep within the earth. It lingered in the room long after she spoke it, sinking into Samuel's thoughts, as if it belonged there. He nodded, repeating it silently in his mind, letting the name etch itself into the quiet corners of his memory. Names held power, and hers was no exception. It was both a shield and a gift, fragile and eternal. Between them, silence settled again, but this time it was no longer empty. It was the kind of silence that holds the weight of two lives slowly weaving together, each thread uncertain but inevitable. Samuel prepared a simple breakfast, cornbread thick with butter, a bowl of venison stew, and placed it before her. She accepted without flourish, eating with care, her movements deliberate, measured. Her hands, though still marked by the cold, showed the grace of someone accustomed to carrying burdens. As she ate, her eyes flicked often to the door, as if listening for something beyond the walls, as if the wind itself might come knocking again. It was then that Samuel noticed what she kept at her side, never once letting it stray from her touch. A small wooden box bound in rawhide, sealed tight. She rested it on her lap while she ate, her hand occasionally brushing against it, protective, almost reverent. He wondered what it held, what secret pressed her so urgently across frozen miles, but he did not ask. He had learned long ago that trust could not be demanded, only given when hearts were ready. So he only watched, curiosity gnawing quietly, and turned his attention to the snow outside the window. When the meal was done, she rose with quiet determination, fastening her worn coat and tucking the box beneath her arm, as though it were part of her own body. Her boots were still damp, her posture weary, but the strength in her stance was undeniable. She faced him then, her eyes steady, her voice carrying a weight older than her years. "My people do not forget kindness," she told him, every word slow and deliberate, like a vow. For a moment, the room seemed to still, the very air pausing to hold her promise. Samuel met her gaze, and though he had no answer that could match the gravity of her words, he nodded, letting his silence be a covenant of its own. She stepped out into the blinding morning, the world beyond the door, nothing but a horizon of white. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she moved away, her figure soon swallowed by the vast expanse, until only memory remained. Samuel stood at the threshold long after, watching the empty plain, feeling a hollowness stir within him where her presence had been. It was not the ache of loneliness he had known before, but something different, an absence filled with longing, with questions that would remain unanswered. The days that followed fell into rhythm again. Samuel returned to his work, hauling feed, mending fences, tending to the cattle that braved the drifts. Yet each night, as the wind tapped against the shutters and the firelight swayed on the walls, he found his thoughts circling back to her, to Tala, to the way her eyes had carried both grief and fire, to the way her words had settled into him like seeds waiting for spring. And always his mind lingered on the box, sealed, guarded, untold. Sometimes he imagined her journey, each step across frozen plains, the storms she must have battled, the nights she must have endured alone. He wondered if she thought of him, if the warmth of his cabin had lingered with her as it lingered with him. He wondered if fate would ever allow their paths to cross again, or if she was destined to remain nothing more than a brief miracle carried to him by the storm. Yet even as the snow deepened and the days stretched long, Samuel felt something healing within him, a quiet warmth that remained even in her absence. He had not sought it, had not asked for it, but Tala's presence had awakened a truth within his solitude, that even the briefest meeting, when forged in fire and storm, could leave behind a light that endured. And though she was gone, That light burned steady in him, guiding him through the endless winter. The horizon remained wide and silent, but Samuel could not shake the sense that her promise was not finished, that somewhere beyond the snow the story was still unfolding, moving ever closer to the moment when it would return to his door once more. The days that followed did not so much pass as unfold, measured in small necessary rituals that kept a man alive through a long winter. Samuel woke before the light and listened to the hush that follows a storm, that wide cathedral silence where even breath felt like a prayer. He stoked the coals, added kindling, breathed the fire awake. He warmed a pan and split the cornbread he had baked 2 nights prior, pressed it between his palms to soften the chill, and ate in a quiet that no longer felt empty. There was a presence in it now, a warmth that endured even after the door had closed on the woman with the fierce eyes and the box bound in rawhide. Tala. Her name lingered like heat in old timber. Outside, the world lay wrapped in white, as if the land itself had chosen to rest. Fences hunched under gathered drifts. The cattle moved in slow, deliberate paths, dark shapes against the pale. He hauled hay with gloved hands and the steady rhythm of a man who had learned to do hard things without arguing with them. The wind needled his cheeks and carried a scent as clean as cut ice. But every time he stopped to breathe, he saw again the delicate steam rising from a chipped mug as she lifted it, the way her fingers, stiff at first, curled around warmth and would not let go. It surprised him how often the memory rose. Not only the image of her by the hearth, but the quiet gravity in her voice, the vow that had settled in the room like a stone set in a riverbed. My people do not forget kindness. He had not been hungry for payment. The idea that another soul had crossed into the storm with a promise clutched like a talisman stirred something gentler in him than pride. Respect, yes, and something companion to it that he did not name. The softness of it didn't make him weak. It steadied him, the way a hand on the shoulder steadies a man as he navigates black ice. On the 3rd morning, sun spilled across the snow with the pale gold of a blessing. He found a fence post cracked clean through, and an old nail biting into frozen wood as if refusing to surrender. He worked slowly, listening to the creak of leather and the soft rip of twine, and in the rhythm of it, the mind does what minds do when the body sets to a task. It travels. He pictured the small box in her lap, the reverent way her palm had drifted to it, as though to confirm, again and again, that it remained. He imagined it not as a treasure, but as something tender and grave, letters perhaps, or a token of her people's grief. Ash, seed, an heirloom that remembered hands long gone. It felt wrong to romanticize another's sorrow, so he brought his thoughts back, softened his grip, and sighed into the cold. As the sun climbed, the snow shifted from pearl to brilliant white. Midway through checking a line of troughs, he heard it, the thin, sharp call of distress that cuts through winter's thick air. A yearling had slipped near the edge of a drift and wedged a hind leg between a trough's frame and a crust of ice. The animal's eyes rolled wide, breath exploding in clouds. Samuel went to one knee in powder that swallowed half his thigh. He soothed the yearling with a steady voice and the gentle weight of touch, pressed gloved fingers beneath the lip of ice, and, with patience and leverage, freed the trapped leg. The yearling trembled, then put weight on it, and his relief felt untidy and human. He laughed into the cold and rubbed the animal's shoulder while it nosed his sleeve. Life asks to be reassured again and again. You are safe now. Some part of him whispered it like a prayer he'd learned as a boy and then forgotten until a stranger knocked on his door. That evening he noticed, almost by accident, that he had set another place at the table. A second tin cup, an extra fold of cloth. He stood there, absurdly still, a small heat rising to his face at the sweetness and ache of the gesture. He did not remove it. He took his supper with the cup beside him, as if memory could drink, as if warmth could be shared across distance. The fire burned bright, the logs crackling with a music that in winter seems close to speech. Sleep came late. When it did, it brought a dream both gentle and vivid. She stood on a ridge beyond the wide white plain, hair lifted by a wind that was not cruel but carrying. In her hands, the rawhide box shone as if it held light rather than wood. The patterns of fibre around it looked at once like binding and like grace. She lifted her gaze, and though the distance between them was the length of a winter, he felt with dream certainty the warmth of her attention, the steadying of it. He woke with a hand outstretched, fingers open, the old astonishment of waking into a room in which one is alone. The cabin breathed around him. The fire's glow sighed against the walls. Snow fell twice more that week, not with the anger of the last storm, but with the slow patience that fills cracks and softens edges. He mended the hinge on the shed door. He sharpened a blade. He found one of the old cedar boxes he used for storing keepsakes and polished it until the grain showed like water. He told himself it was a simple task, the pleasure of oil and cloth and wood. But when he set it on the shelf, empty still, his chest untightened in a way he refused to examine. He would not be a boy building a shrine to a moment, but neither would he disrespect the feeling that the moment deserved to be kept. Memory, too, needs a place to live. Each day he walked a different line through the drifts, learning again the old lesson that a landscape is never the same twice. A line of coyote prints embroidered the leeward side of a hill. A hawk's shadow skimmed the snow with the soundless purpose of hunger. He found a feather near a cottonwood where the wind always gathered. He brushed snow from it with his thumb and slid it into his pocket. Not because he needed it, but because beauty, when you stumble over it in a hard season, is permission to breathe. It was near that cottonwood, days later, that he discovered the small thing he could not quite explain. Tucked in the shelter of the trunk, partly frozen into the crust, lay a narrow braid of rawhide, the kind a hand makes when restlessness needs to become craft. It looked like a scrap, and perhaps it was. He turned it in his fingers and saw that one edge had been notched, not in carelessness, but in rhythm, as if to count days or prayers. Yet he had no right to give it a story. He slipped it into his pocket anyway and walked home slower, listening to the snow give under his boots with the soft complaint of weather weary of itself. The cabin approached like an old friend, holding its jaw against the wind. Inside, the air welcomed him with that tired domestic scent, smoke and wool, and the faint sweetness of coffee that has kissed iron. He set the rawhide braid beside the cedar box on the shelf without thought, and only then realized what he had done. He stood a long time with his hands on the back of the chair, the weight of simple objects altering the weight of the room. He did not speak the thought that arrived. He let it dissolve on the tongue of silence and enter him all the same. When he slept that night, he did not dream of storms. He dreamed of hands, not faces, hands, hands threading, binding, stitching in winter light, hands offering and receiving. When he woke, All the simple tasks of the day felt like part of something larger and unhurried, as if he were adding his own small stitch to a cloth he would never see finished. That feeling did not swell into grand notions. It remained humble, like a warm stone in a pocket that one rubs with the pad of a thumb in the moments between duties. There were hours when longing pressed on him hard enough to steal breath. Plain, honest hours when the mind asked, "Where is she?" and his chest answered by tightening. But even those hours seemed to carry a healing current. If desire is a wild river, his was a bend made gentle by snow melt and time. He did not fight it. He let it run through him, clearing the old silt of loneliness so that something clean could shine beneath. One evening, as the sky took on that soft blue that winter sometimes steals from summer, he lit the lamp and drew the cloak he rarely wore across his shoulders. It was not the fine weave he would later receive, not yet. It was his own old wool, smelling of lanolin and wood smoke. He placed an extra log on the fire and sat with his back to the wall, where he could see the door and the window both, not as a sentry, but as a man who understood that thresholds are where stories change. The wind rose and fell in the eaves. He closed his eyes, and, for the briefest moment, felt again the weight of her promise settle into his ribs like a beam set true. Something in him rose to meet it, not in pride or demand, but in the quiet knowledge that love, with or without a name, begins wherever a vow is kept. He went to bed with that calm, and in the small hours woke to the kind of hush that feels like a held breath. It was not silence. It was the world listening. He lay still, the quilt a gentle weight, the fire aglow at the edge of sight. Then, faint at first, and so regular he thought his heart had grown louder, he heard it. A pattern in the distance. Not wind, not the winter creak of old timber. A cadence, hoof-beats, counted by snow. The sound drew closer, unhurried yet certain, a pulse against the open plain. He sat up and swung his legs to the floor. The room did not change, but he had the sense of entering it for the first time. He dressed without hurry, pulled on his boots, and, at the door, let his palm settle for a heartbeat against the old wood, worn smooth by years of weather and hands. Outside, the sky held that pale gold found on the other side of suffering. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, breath leaving him in plumes that drifted away like thoughts you release because they are ready to go. On the horizon, the faint shapes gathered definition. Riders pulling a small caravan through the gentle snow, the steady dignity of a procession that has not come to ask, but to answer. The wind moved his hair, and in the quiet between one hoofbeat and the next, he felt time narrow and widen all at once, like a river meeting its own reflection. He did not think of silver or cloth. He did not even think of the box. He thought only of a promise that had crossed a winter and found his door, and of a woman whose eyes had carried both fire and grief, and of the way the world offers, now and then, the grace of a circle closing. He stood there as they approached, the porch boards solid beneath his boots, the cold unimportant, the waiting a kind of prayer answered in its own time. And as the riders drew near, and the leading figure swung down with the composure of one who knows both burden and honor, he knew that whatever crossed his threshold next would carry not only gratitude, but the beginning of a truth he had been learning the shape of since the night a stranger knocked and winter let her in. They came with the quiet gravity of mountains moving, not loudly, but with a certainty that softened the air around them. Snow, which had all week kept to its slow, patient descent, seemed to pause on each flake to watch. Samuel stood at the edge of the porch, hat in his hand, the cold touching his face without biting. For there are mornings when the heart makes its own weather. The first rider reached the yard and reined in with an ease that belonged to people who had taught their lives to flow with the land rather than wrestle it. And there she was, Tala, sliding from her saddle as if dismounting were a ritual that returned her to the earth. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and then left it alone, as if recognizing a boundary. For a moment time thinned into a clear thread between them. They did not speak. Everything that had needed to be said on that first night, her plea, his welcome, the promise that had sealed itself into the warm air by the fire, lived in the space where words might have gone. Only when her boots sank into the soft crust of the yard did the spell loosen. She approached with measured steps, holding out what she carried the way one brings forward something that matters not for what it costs, but for what it remembers, a hand-woven cloak, colours braided from earth and sky and water, a small leather pouch tied with sinew. "A promise kept," she said, voice steady, eyes steady. The simple truth of it settled between them like the first weight of spring on a thawing branch. Samuel took the cloak into his hands. It surprised him how alive it felt, the weft firm yet supple, the warp lines precise as heartbeat. The patterns were stories he could not read but could feel. The colours were not bright as a flag but deep as a riverbed, the kind of hues that do not shout because they are certain. He brushed his thumb over a band the colour of dusk, and felt his chest loosen, as if some tightness he had learned to ignore had been quietly unlaced. He opened the pouch. Silver kissed the winter light. He closed it again, not from greed, not from any thought of value, but in a gesture of respect, as one would draw shut the lid of a cedar box that holds a name. "It's too much," he began, and then stopped himself because he heard, beneath his own words, the rattling of an old habit, measuring kindness as if it were a ledger. Tala's expression did not harden, did not soften. It remained clear, her chin lifted a fraction. "It is what is due," she replied. The phrasing was not defensive, not proud, simply exact. He understood that if he argued with this, he would be arguing with the river, with the medicine of balance. She stepped back, and the riders behind her inclined their heads, the movement light, but weighted with the collective grace of their presence. One, older than the rest, with lines cut into his face by wind and time, dismounted and came forward. He had the manner of a man trusted to carry the voice of many. He spoke in a tongue Samuel did not know, and then, after a pause, in the English that bridged them, "We remember." The words were sparse and whole. Samuel nodded, a man unused to ceremony, and yet certain that this, whatever it was, however brief, was ceremony of the kind that has kept people woven together long enough to survive winters that would have unmended them otherwise. They gathered in a loose half-circle near the porch where the snow had been trampled into a clean oval. The horses breathed clouds. Their ears flicked in an unhurried rhythm, as if listening too. Samuel wanted to ask 100 questions and knew he would ask none. He stood with his hat at his side, the cloak over one forearm, the pouch in his hand, and allowed the clear air to shape him into something steadier. He noticed details his future self would treasure. The way Tala's boots bore the mark of many miles, the fine crack along the left cheek of one rider's saddle horn, a feather tucked into another's braid. He noticed Tala's hands, and the memory of his dream, the dream of hands crafting, binding, offering, returned to him as a warm echo. Tala's gaze moved briefly to the house, the door that had opened to her, the hearth whose breath still lingered in the timbers. She looked back at him. "I carried something to my people," she said, not as confession, but as completion. The small wooden box from that night did not appear in her arms today. It had gone ahead of her or remained where it belonged. "It arrived," she added, and though the details were still hers to keep, something in her voice loosened in relief, like a knot eased by patient fingers. He nodded. He did not need the story to feel its weight. The knowing passed between them like the touch of sunlight through thin cloud. "Will you come in?" he asked. "Rest a while?" The invitation was ordinary. The yes or no would not be. The older man glanced at Tala. She gave a small sign, no more than a breath moving through her shoulders, that he understood. "We will water the horses down at the creek," the older man said to Samuel. "We will wait." He gestured with a kindness that made a circle without closing it. Tala stepped forward. Inside, the air welcomed them with that tender mixture of wood smoke and iron and the faint sweetness of coffee that never entirely leaves a kettle. The fire caught at a log and threw sparks like scattered stars that chose to land instead of burn out. The room did not change, and yet it did. Some old shyness in it released, made room. Tala moved to the hearth, as she had before, not with the desperate collapse of cold, but with the quiet assurance of a guest returning on her own terms. Samuel set the cloak across the back of the chair, as if dressing the room itself. He set the pouch beside it. He poured coffee. They did not rush. He placed a bowl of stew in her hands, and the steam rose between them like breath shared. She ate slowly, not from caution now, but because slowness made value visible. Each spoonful seemed to complete a small circle, the work of hands that had harvested and dried and stored, the patience of winter meals taken by firelight, the gratitude that needs no name to work its medicine. "You kept the night," she said at last, looking into the hearth but speaking to him. He knew what she meant. Not I saved you, not you saved me. A night was kept, intact, sacred, unbroken by harm or demand. He exhaled, and the simple truth of that felt like warmth added to warmth. "If you had not come to my door," he said, "the storm would have passed anyway." He wanted to say, "And I would have been the same." But the sentence refused that ending. He let it remain unfinished, which is sometimes how truth keeps its shine. She glanced at him, gaze searching and bright. "A storm passes," she agreed, "but not everything returns to what it was." The corner of her mouth lifted, the smallest thread of light in winter. It was not a smile for charm. It was what gratitude looks like when it stays honest. He found himself telling her small things, as one sets a few good pieces of wood onto an established fire. The yearling he had freed near the trough, the feather by the cottonwood, the rawhide braid he had found and set on the shelf without knowing why it had felt right to keep. At that, Tala turned her head, the feather-quick attention of someone who recognizes a pattern stitch by stitch. "A braid," she echoed softly. He lifted a hand toward the shelf and then stopped, question simmering. "I thought it a scrap," he admitted, "but it held company." The word was clumsy. It was also exact. "It was not lost," she said, and he heard in her tone the clear bell of a thing returned to itself. "Thank you." They spoke of other plain things, the creek's edge where water still ran under a skin of ice, the hawk that hunted the leeward side of the ridge, the way snow sometimes squeaks under boots when the cold tightens down far enough to make its own voice. He did not ask what had been in the box. She did not offer it. The respect in that unasked question was not absence. It was a bridge held up by good joinery. When they rose at last, the room seemed to rise with them, as if relieved to have carried once more what it had been built to hold: shelter, bread, the kind of conversation that does not pry yet unknots. At the door he lifted the cloak again. "I will wear this," he said, "with the knowledge of what it means." He did not say gift. He did not say debt. He did not say paid. He said knowledge. Tala nodded, and for the first time her gaze dropped, not in submission, but in acknowledgment of the tenderness that such knowledge requires. "It was woven with stories," she answered. "When you wear it, your warmth becomes part of them." He felt that in his bones. The idea did not make him larger. It made him careful in the way of people who understand that they carry something alive. Out in the yard, the riders straightened in unison with the unspoken readiness of those who know how to move together. The older man met Samuel's eyes and touched his chest lightly with an open palm. It was not a custom Samuel had words for, but he recognized its shape. "I place you here for a moment, in my care." He mirrored the gesture, awkward in body, but sure in heart. The horses stamped and snorted, breath coiling like silk in the cold. One of the younger riders, no more than a boy, cheeks red as embers under skin, tilted his head toward Samuel's porch roof. "Good wood," he said in a thin, clear voice, and grinned. Samuel grinned back, the moment small and unaccountably precious. A bead slipped onto the thread of a day already heavy with ceremony. Tala swung into the saddle with that same unshowy grace. The cloak of her people settled across her shoulders. Another pattern, other colors, a different story from the one he'd been given, but kin to it. The sun tipped along the horizon like a cup pouring out gold. She looked down at him, and he understood that this would not be a speech or a farewell rehearsed. It would be a glance that held what language cannot without bruising. "There is a ridge where the wind helps you see far," she said, a single offering, neither instruction nor promise. He nodded, and the ridge came to him, the place where he had dreamed of her standing with the box that glowed like it held light. He did not tell her that. He kept it like a seed under his tongue. He stepped back as the horses turned. Snow made a music that is only made by hooves and cold and patience. The procession did not rush, did not dawdle. It moved the way certainty moves, with humility and purpose. He watched until the bright of the sun and the bright of the snow made his eyes water, until the silhouettes became brushstrokes across the plain, and then memory. He did not try to hold the moment still. He let it pass through him and take up residence where it wished. When the last whisper of their presence slid into the vastness, he lifted the cloak and drew it across his arm again, the weight of it settling like a hand placed where a man needs steadying. Inside, the room received him as if he had been gone a month instead of a handful of breaths. He set the cloak by the fire where the colors, in the flicker of flame, deepened into themselves. He loosened the pouch and let the silver spill into his cedar box. Not carelessly, not with the hurry of someone eager to hide it, but with the thoughtfulness of placing a pebble at the foot of a cairn others have built. The coins rang softly, like a string struck and then muted by a careful finger. He closed the lid and sat back, hands braced on his knees, the silence around him no longer vast but full. Only then did he allow the ache in him to make itself known, not the ache of loss alone, but the ache of recognition. The heart, once it has known the clean lines of an honest exchange, refuses to be content with what is lesser. He did not resent the ache. He welcomed it. It arrived with its own warmth, a heat that did not scorch, but kept the blood supple. He breathed with it until breath and ache found a rhythm that could carry him into the evening without straining either one. The light outside softened into the blue that makes windows glow like gentle lanterns. He set water to heat and washed the day from his hands. The rawhide braid sat beside the cedar box with a modest patience. He took it up and, after a moment's hesitation, slid it into the box as well, not to lock it away, but to set it among other kept things so it would not carry the weight alone. When he closed the lid again, a small calm slid through him, tidy as the closing of a gate against drifting snow. Night returned as a blessing, and not a test. He pulled the cloak around his shoulders for a while and sat in the chair by the fire, letting the wool learn his shape, letting his warmth step into its stories. The patterns seemed to shift in the low light, not changing so much as revealing new threads to a patient eye. He traced one with his gaze until his breathing evened and his mind, for the first time in many days, fell all the way into rest without clinging to a worry's edge. When sleep came, it did not carry the sharp hush of storms. It carried the soft syllables of things finished and the quiet anticipations of things yet to begin. He dreamed of the ridge, the one where wind helps you see far. In the dream he stood there, not alone, but not yet hand in hand. Space remained. Respect remained. Longing did too, but it did not hunger. It waited with the dignity of a fire banked for morning. He woke before dawn, the room grey with the first breath of day. Outside, the snow held its pale glow. Inside, the cloak held his warmth. He rose and moved through the old motions, the kettle on, the fire fed, feeling each task as a bead he could now name. The morning asked nothing extravagant of him. It asked only that he stay true to the angle at which his heart had been set the night before. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The horizon wore its wide, clean line. Somewhere beyond it, horses were making tracks that would be smoothed by wind. Somewhere closer, the creek ran its small, faithful speech beneath ice. He rested his hands against the porch rail, felt the grain under his skin, and let the cool enter him the way a truth enters when you stop talking long enough to hear it. Promises kept do not end a story. They make room for what comes genuinely next. In the quiet, after their departure, something in him shifted from waiting to attending, from holding breath to breathing. Without forcing the thought into words, he knew this. A circle had closed, and out of it a new line had been drawn, leading away from his door in one direction and back toward it in another, both true, both honorable. He stood there until the pale bright of morning gathered itself into day, and then he stepped down into the yard to follow his rounds. The pattern of his life, the same in shape and different in meaning, steady as hoofbeats counted by snow, guiding him toward what would soon arrive and change the cut of his days again. The days after the caravan's departure unfolded with a new clarity, as if the storm had washed the world clean and left behind only lines that meant something. Samuel carried his rounds the way a careful man carries a lantern in dim light, not to show himself off, but to see a little farther with each step. The cloak found its place around his shoulders in the early hours and in the long blue of evening, the weave warming to his shape until he could feel, without looking, where dusk-dark bands crossed the chest, and where a thread the colour of river mud wandered close to the hem like a small private path. He did not flaunt it to the cattle or the wind. He simply wore it and learned its quiet company. The rawhide braid rested in the cedar box beside the silver, the way a note of music rests within a chord. Sometimes, after the kettle hissed and the fire found its steady breath, he would lift the lid and let his gaze linger on those plain treasures, the modest length of rawhide, the coins dulled by the oil of his hands, the soft weave folded like a patient animal across the chair's back. Not all value rings loud. Some settles in, and a man hears it the way he hears his own heartbeat when the house sleeps. But this was more than objects keeping company with memory. It was a new angle of living. He found himself speaking more often, though his audience was only a yearling, a hawk, or the empty room, because to speak something aloud is to set it down gently where it can be tended. He told the creek, because it was a good listener, about a ridge where wind helps you see far. He told the ridge, when he reached it, the truth he had not carried to any altar in years, that a night kept whole has the power to heal a man who did not know he'd broken. The ridge was a clean-backed animal of earth rising from the plain, not dramatic, no rock teeth jutting from its crown, just a long breath of land that lifted a man high enough to see the horizon curve and the colour change in bands like a woven cloth, snow to sage to sky. The wind there did not cut, it combed. He stood with his boots planted and let it pass through the cloak and the wool of his shirt, and the sturdy weave of muscle and thought, and on the other side of breath the world sharpened. Miles away, a line of cottonwoods stitched the creek's winding with dark thread. Farther still, the faint movement of animals wrote its living glyphs across the white. The sky bore that winter blue that aches a little when you stare into it too long. The ache not of pain, but of praise you haven't the words for. He went there in the morning first, then again near twilight. He did not admit, to himself or to the cold, that he was waiting. Waiting is a hunger word, and this was gentler than hunger. It was attending. He attended to the air, the way a man attends to a violin's tuning, listening for the moment when the note falls exactly into place. He attended to hoof-scuffs half erased by wind, to the delicate script of bird feet written along the drift's lip, to an absence that did not feel empty. On the third evening he saw her. She did not arrive like a vision that startles. She was part of the landscape before she became herself. Horse first, then rider, then the particular steadiness of the woman who had stood in his doorway and changed the temperature of his days. The sun had lowered enough to lay its gentle gold along the ridge's spine. She brought that gold with her, or the gold recognized her and leaned upon her shoulders. He did not move toward her. He stayed still, so that the moment could choose its own grace. She dismounted with the same easy intimacy with earth that he remembered, and for a few breaths they let the wind speak between them. The horse nosed the snow, patient, as if it knew it had been allowed into a place narrower than territory and wider than maps. "You found it," she said. Her voice fit here. It did not press, did not hurry. She might have been speaking to the ridge, and the ridge would have answered. "I did." "You see far?" "Far enough," he said. And the two words opened like a hand. He did not say what he saw. The way her arrival made the horizon real. The way the winter in her presence felt less like a test and more like a blessing that had asked much and given more. They stood side by side, not touching. This was a place that asked for respect, and respect has a posture. He felt through the cloak the warmth his body had given it over the last days, and the warmth it returned to him now, shared heat, like two palms meeting with a gratitude beyond language. The wind smoothed the edges of their silence until the quiet felt like a living thing that trusted them. "I carried the box to my people," she said after a while, not as a confession, not as a story hoarded and then spilled, but as the continuation of something that had begun the night the storm drove her to his door. What was inside belonged to a promise older than I am. We don't speak the names of the items when they're traveling or when they've just come home. It keeps them whole. He listened with his whole body. The ridge made a clean line north and south, and he felt himself aligned to it, as if the story itself were a compass needle. "I won't ask," he said. "You are not asking," she replied, and he understood the distinction. To be silent from reverence is not the same as being silent from fear. Her gaze moved across the plain, and for a breath her face softened into an expression he had not seen in her yet, the naked relief of a burden set down where it belongs. He felt that relief in his shoulders and let them loosen, not as mimicry, but as semblance, the way a body mirrors the truth it stands near. "We brought the cloak and silver because balance is a medicine, and medicine must be made," she continued, "but I also came for my own reasons." She turned toward him then, eyes finding his with a steadiness that did not claim more than it offered. "There is a kind of debt that is not paid with cloth or coin. It is paid with returning, not to even a score, but to honor a crossing. I wanted to stand where you stood and see what you see." He looked out with her. "In winter," he said, "the world tells the truth in clean lines. It's easier to recognize it, and harder to ignore." They let a small smile rise between them, small because the moment asked for lightness without carelessness. In that smile, he felt something ease in him that had not known how tightly it had been held. He did not fall into love like a man slipping through thin ice. He stepped into it the way one steps into a warm room from the cold, aware of threshold, grateful for the change, careful with what his presence might disturb. They spoke then of plain things made sacred by attention. He told her about the hawk's hunting path. She told him where the deer lay when wind carved knives through open ground. He pointed out a thread of darker snow where a creek ran beneath. She drew a small map in the surface at their feet with the blunt end of a glove, a circle here where a spring sighed up even in January, a notch there where the earth remembered a fire and kept its ash under snow like a kept ember. Each detail felt like beadwork placed between them, small and exact, the pattern emergent and honest. When she mentioned the rawhide braid, a colour moved through her voice that made him think of the cloak's dusk band. "There are no scraps," she said, and even the wind seemed to nod. "We braid to carry time when hands need work that means something. When we leave a piece behind, it's a marker. Not for anyone to follow, but for the land to know we were with it." She paused, thumb rubbing idly at the ridge of her glove. "You gave it a room. That's a good way to keep company with what you don't yet know." "I've had empty rooms," he said quietly. Some needed to stay empty for a while. Others were waiting without my knowing it. She did not fill that with comfort. She let the words stand, strong on their own legs, and her silence felt like the hand of a friend steadying a beam while you sink the nail. This was the healing he had not known to ask for, not a salve spread over wounds, but a companion presence that permitted the wound to breathe and knit. As the sun dipped, the wind gathered a little strength, not harsh, just present. She drew her own cloak closer, not the one she had given him, but its kin, and he felt an impulse move through him like the first step of a dance he had not practiced yet. He offered, not by reaching, but by slightly angling himself to block the wind's direct path. The gesture changed nothing of the weather. It changed everything of the moment. She noticed. He could feel her notice in the way her breath left and returned, a tiny shift, an allowance. "My mother taught me," she said after a quiet span, "that there are debts with more than one direction. Sometimes we think we are the ones who must repay, and sometimes we learn we were also receiving." She looked at him without adornment. "You took me in and did not ask of me what the storm made me. I would repay that by memory, by cloth, by coin. But I also learned, in that firelight, that I was not only carrying the box, I was being carried. There is a debt there too, and it is to the truth itself. To return and say, 'I remember the way you did not ask for my story before it was ready.'" The wind carried her words across the ridge and set them down gently in his chest. He realized, with a weft-deep certainty, that what had changed him most on that night was not the drama of rescue, but the ordinary sanctity of hospitality done without pride. He had not named it then. Standing beside her now, he named it and felt the naming take its place within him, like a beam finally called by its right name and therefore suited to bear weight. He found himself wanting to ask for nothing and everything at once, to know the color of her childhood summer sky, to learn the shape of grief that had taught her spine its quiet steel, to memorize the cadence of her voice when she spoke not for ceremony but for the simple joy of speaking. He did not gather those wants into questions. He let them warm him from within, like stones heated at the fire and placed carefully under a blanket for the night. "Will you come again?" he asked, not as a plea, not as a demand, but as a direction offered and set gently between them like a cup of water. "I will," she said. She did not make a calendar of it. Some returns are stronger for not being scheduled. "And you can come to the ridge when the wind is right. I will hear it. The land carries messages for those who listen." She rested her palm briefly on the horse's neck, a bridge between lives. "There is work to do with my people. Winter asks much. But there is also this." He nodded. "There is also this." They remained until the last gold bled out of the snow and the first blue of evening gathered them into its careful hold. When she mounted, it was with a cadence that felt like punctuation, a comma, not a period. He stood and watched her move along the ridge, then down its gentle flank, the horse's hooves making that soft squeak that cold snow makes when it agrees to your passage. She disappeared not abruptly, but the way conversations pause when both people understand that the next words will be better for the waiting. He lingered after, letting the dark come without resistance. The stars took their places with an urgency that, to him, never felt like haste, only purpose, each light finding its right square of night. He breathed until his breath and the ridge's breath and the horse's fading breath somewhere below the hill all fell into a rhythm old as bone. Back at the cabin, the room received him new again. He set a kettle, sank another log, folded the cloak across its favoured chair. He did not need to open the cedar box to feel the presence of what it kept. The rawhide braid, the silver, the room itself. They hummed in the quiet, a music the ear doesn't catch, but the body does. He moved through the small motions of warming broth and cutting a heel of bread with the attention that makes food into blessing. The spoon made its simple circle in the bowl. His mind echoed it. The circle of a promise kept, the circle of returning, the circle of standing on a ridge beside a woman who had learned time and patience from a world that measures both more carefully than clocks. He slept with the cloak laid over the foot of the bed and dreamed, not of storms or of ridges, but of rooms. Rooms inside a heart, long closed, now unlatched. Rooms that did not flood with light, but acquired it slowly, like dawn deepening from pearl to gold. In one room, a chair by a fire. In another, a map drawn not in ink, but in remembered wind. In another, a low table where a small carved box once rested, then travelled, then came home to stories that could bear it. He woke before the first grey and lay for a time simply feeling his life settle into its frame. There was work to be done. Always there is, but the work would be done by a man altered by a ridge and a voice, and a winter that instead of breaking him, had shaped him to fit the truth better. He rose. The day entered itself. He opened the door, and the morning entered him with that clean, hopeful cold that makes the lungs feel younger. Out by the creek, ice thinned where the water insisted. He crouched to watch it, and felt the patience of Thor begin, not as a spectacle, but as a fact. He smiled, and the smile did not feel stolen or shy. It felt earned. He thought of her, not as absence now, but as presence elsewhere, carrying her work, carrying their quiet, carrying the knowledge that some crossings do not end at payment. They become paths walked often enough to wear kindness into the ground. When the wind shifted mid-morning, he heard it, not hoofbeats, not voices, a change in the air that drew a line from ridge to cabin, and asked nothing but listening. He paused, hand on the gate, and listened as a man listens when he knows the next chapter is not later but already beginning, soft as breath against a door that has learned the habit of opening. The wind changed before the weather did, the way it often does on the plains, subtle first, then sure, like a hand turning a page you didn't know you'd been reading. Samuel felt it in the yard while tightening the strap of a gate that preferred to sag toward earth. He felt it again that evening at the ridge when the air arrived from the north with a clean, glassy edge. He had learned to hear these small shifts, and now he heard inside them something else as well, the intimation of parting. Not the catastrophic kind that tears, the honorable kind that recognizes each life's rightful center and does not ask what it has no right to keep. Tala came to the ridge again, wrapped in the cloak that bore her people's colors. Earth, cloud, dusk, river. She dismounted, the horse standing quiet as a prayer behind her. Words weren't first, they rarely were between them. They faced the plains side by side and gave the horizon their attention the way one gives a friend a seat at a table. In the hush, the world did what it does when it is well attended. It revealed itself without performance. A filament of smoke far to the west suggested a camp or a hearth. The hawk wrote its precise cursive along a band of wind that had made a road out of nothing. The creek, invisible at this distance, announced itself by the darker thread of willow and cottonwood stitched into snow. "Another storm will come," she said finally, "quicker than the last, and less patient." He nodded. "I've felt it pressing." He had seen the cattle choose lower ground, and the magpies cut a shorter arc in evening flight. "I will need to be with my people," she continued. "We prepare, we carry wood, we tend the old ones who should not walk in wind like knives. There is work with names and work without names, and in a storm the work without names often matters most." He had expected it, but the hearing drew a thin pain across his chest, like cold air, sharp and clarifying. He breathed through it. "And I will be here," he said, simple as fence line. "There's the shed roof I've braced, and a heifer near calving. My hands will be full." Her glance toward him carried both gratitude and something more tender. The recognition that two lives can be full and still make room to hold each other without crushing anything delicate. "This place has your shape," she said. "It answers you." She didn't say that his attention had given it back some of its old music. He felt it anyway, the way a man feels warmth in wool that has learned him. They spoke in details the way they always did, weaving care into practicality, where to leave a signal if a path was blocked, how to listen for the undernote of ice when it thins but doesn't yet show its intention. Which ridge held the least malice in crosswinds, where a body might stand and not be stripped of heat for the privilege of seeing farther. They did not script a next meeting. The land and their work would hold that. To place a date upon it would have felt like pinning a butterfly to a board. Visible, yes, but less alive. When she stepped closer, it was not with a hunger that would have broken what they had so carefully honored. It was with the calm curiosity of a hand reaching toward another's pulse simply to feel proof. He did not move to close the last inch. It closed itself, or perhaps it had never really been there. They breathed in a rhythm old as weather, his chest's rise answering hers answering his, until the wind turned and made them separate, so they would not steal warmth. The world would soon require of them. "Make a place near your fire," she said softly. "Keep a bowl and cup for whoever knocks." "I have," he answered. "And I will." He did not say that the extra cup had become an elegy and a promise both. He didn't need to. Before she mounted, she drew a small pouch from the inner fold of her cloak. Not coin, not ceremony. She placed it in his palm. It weighed almost nothing. "Red willow bark," she said. "For when the ache in your hands tells you to stop and you must keep on, boil it low and slow. Do not rush medicine. It refuses." He smiled then, a quiet thing that held. "There's a jar of bear fat I keep for leather and for winter cracks," he replied. "I'll set some aside in case your work bites." It was less a trade than an echo, kindness answering kindness in the language of use. She tucked the idea away with an almost invisible nod. Then came the moment he had known would come since the very first knocking through storm and wood, the necessary step back that makes room for leaving. She made it. He accepted it. The horse breathed a soft white into the air and turned its head as if listening for a distant call. She laid her hand against its neck, then against the bowl of wind where his shoulder would be if closeness did not need to become a burden. He felt the ghost of that touch and let it steady him. "Keep the ridge," she said. It could have been instruction. It could have been blessing. He took it as both. "And you," he answered, "keep the road between us honest." That road had no name, but it had rules, no promises that outran truth, no turns taken in pride, no silence used as punishment, only the silence that protects, the words that build, the returns that arrive when they should. She swung into the saddle with the easy mercy of someone who has asked much of her body and taught it not to argue with duty. She looked down at him for a heartbeat longer than courtesy requires. It felt like a hand placed quietly on a table between them. "I am here. I was here. I will be here in the ways that do not betray the ways I am bound." He placed his hat against his thigh, not as doffing, not as plea, but as an acknowledgment of a sovereign presence. She went then, without flourish. The horse's hooves made that gentle squeak in the cold that he had come to love, like spun sugar pressed by a thumb, a sound almost domestic in the wide austerity of winter. He watched until distance softened edges, until the ridge held only wind and the imprint of her last step, until looking further would have turned a witness's love into a measurement. He lowered his gaze and turned toward the home that would receive him as it always had, but with doors slightly wider, with light slightly warmer where it pooled on the floor. That night he placed the little pouch of red willow bark beside the cedar box and the rawhide braid, making a small congregation of objects that asked nothing and kept vigil in their way. He boiled a fistful, slow and patient, as if the steam could carry gratitude. He dipped a cloth and wrung it out and pressed it to the ache that had been building along the thick tendon at his thumb. The relief was not dramatic. It was honest, which is a better thing. He laughed once, low. "You were right," he said to the air that still held a trace of her. "Medicine won't be rushed." In the days that followed, the wind made good on its promise. It came in hard from the north, driving a new skin of storm before it, a white that didn't rage but insisted. It reached into cracks and seams, testing the work he had done. The bracing held. The shed door whined and then minded. At dawn, when sound is thin and clean, he heard the creek's voice dim, and then return where the water found its narrow throat and refused to be silenced. He went out wrapped in the cloak she had given him, and the steadiness of being known, and let both be weather against weather. There were small crises, there always are, and he took them as a man takes cups from a shelf and fills them in order. The heifer chose a bad hour to labour. He knelt in straw and breath and coaxed calf and mother into agreement with what the world asked of them. He returned a lamb, yes, one, lost in drift to the warmth of wool and milk. He set his shoulder to a gate when the hinge resolved to quit, and persuaded it that now was not the time to start new habits. Each act felt like placing a pebble in a path others would find later and bless without knowing whose hand had set it. In those hours, memory did not gnaw, it nourished. He held, with the same hand, the bridle of a stubborn mare, and the recollection of her voice saying, "We don't speak the names of the items when they're travelling or when they've just come home. It keeps them whole." He realized, somewhere between the trough and the woodpile, that his own heart was such an item. To speak its newness too quickly or to demand of it a declaration would have made it brittle. He let it travel. He tended the fire and his breath and the animals, and trusted that the road between them was being kept honest by two lives working, by wind carrying messages not as rumour, but as proof that the world remains tied together by threads finer and stronger than most notice. The storm peaked on a night when the sky erased itself. He woke twice to the sound of snow shifting off the roof like sheets being pulled from a bed. The second time he rose and made a circuit of the room with a lamp, this old way of ensuring that what you love hasn't gone unseen while you slept. The cedar box took the light and gave it back as a shine along its grain. The rawhide braid cast a slim shadow, humble as ever. The cup he kept ready on the table beside the extra bowl made a soft circle on the wood. He set the lamp down and stood very still. "I kept the night," he whispered, childlike and solemn both, and felt, not imagined, the way the house agreed. He lay down again and slept the sleep that follows integrity. Not heavy, not drugged, but relieved. Morning carried a clarity that made his breath hitch. The storm had gone on to practice its art elsewhere. The plane looked remade, although no hand but wind and cold had touched it. Drifts rounded fence posts into monks' shoulders. The sky showed that clean blue that can make a man's eyes water with no sorrow in it at all. He walked to the ridge, not with urgency, but with an attender's pace. The snow squeaked in approval. At the ridge he stood in sunlight so thin and exact that it felt like being measured by a kindly instrument. The breath he let go came out of him as gratitude first, longing second. Far to the east, a small line of movement disclosed itself, too far for faces, close enough for meaning. A caravan? No. Two riders only, headed not toward him, but along a path that would eventually place them at the flank of the winter camp he knew must be forming. He raised a hand, not to wave, he would not import that language here, but in acknowledgement. "I see the pattern. I honor it." His hand fell, and the moment did not collapse. It settled. When he turned back, he found sign he had not left, a knot of willow, tied in a way that made beauty out of necessity, tucked into a notch of rock where wind could not bully it. A token of passing, a blessing. He did not press questions against it. He took it in his palm, felt its simple intelligence, and left it where it was meant to be seen. Not all gifts are for taking. Some are for finding and being found by. Later, when the day took on afternoon's gentle fatigue, he sat with the cloak across his knees and mended a small tear along the hem where a nail-head had caught. The act was intimate without sentimentality. Needle, thread, the pinch of wool, the careful bite through fibres. He thought of her hands doing this work by a different fire, maybe now, maybe earlier, maybe later. The thought did not ache in the way of absence. It warmed in the way of company. That night he spoke aloud, not to conjure and not to console, but to set shape to what had shaped him. "We did not demand story," he said into the flame's soft doctrine. "We let it breathe." The words were not clever. They were correct. He slept and dreamed not of leaving or return, but of the space between, a corridor lit by small lamps at regular intervals, each a kept promise, each a cup left ready. Days returned to their sturdy order, and within that order the unusual became unsurprising. A feather placed on the porch rail where wind could have taken it, but hadn't. A line of delicate boot prints near the cottonwood that stopped before the trunk and turned back, not because of fear, but because reverence knows when to keep a distance. He answered these with gestures of his own. A wedge of cornbread left on the ridge's ledge where fox often passed, a handful of grain scattered for birds who had gambled and stayed. Sometimes longing came in like weather, sudden, complete, and he met it at the door with the plain hospitality he had been taught by the keeping of that first night. "You may sit by the fire," he would say, not aloud and not with drama, "but you may not root out the chairs." It would sit, it would warm, it would leave. In its wake he felt cleaner, like glass after a careful hand and hot water. In the early blue one morning, he heard 3 knocks in the wind's language. Not on his door, on his day. He set down his cup and looked up even before the horses crested the low rise west of the yard. This time not a procession, not ceremony. 2 figures against the pale, one he knew in the tilt of her shoulders, the other taller, broad through the chest, carrying the kind of quiet that only men who've listened long to older women learn to carry well. He stepped out onto the porch, with the calm that knows it has nothing to prove and everything to receive rightly. The snow took his weight and offered it back. The ridge behind him held the sky in its patient curve. The road between them held. And in the breath before the greeting, when the world narrows and widens all at once, he understood that parting had not been a loss but a shaping, that longing had not been a wound but a corridor, that what would happen next would not replace what had been, but set it in relief, finer and clearer, a line true enough to guide a hand. The sky carried the softness of late winter, that fragile light where the sun lingers but does not yet carry the strength of spring. Samuel stood at the porch rail, the wood smooth under his palm, and breathed in air sharp enough to wake but gentle enough to remind him he was alive. The plains stretched wide, unbroken, every line of snow a story written by wind, every shadow of cloud a passing hymn. Yet beneath the quiet grandeur of it, his heart carried the weight of all that had come, the storm, the knock at his door, the fire that had bound 2 souls in silence more eloquent than words, the cloak folded with reverence, the red willow bark, the braid, the silver, the promise kept. These things lived now not as objects, but as companions, breathing beside him like unseen friends who remind you that even in solitude you are never truly alone. Tala's visits had become more than memory. They were living presence, woven into the rhythm of his days. Sometimes it was her voice he heard in the wind, speaking truths that travelled farther than miles. Sometimes it was her absence, a quiet that did not wound but healed, reminding him that love does not always demand proximity. It demands honesty, patience, and respect. He had learned to keep a place at his table, not for lack, but for remembrance. He had learned to read the ridge not only as land, but as altar, where silence could become prayer, and prayer could become listening. And he had learned that longing, when tended with gentleness, ceases to be hunger and becomes devotion. On a morning touched with pale gold, he saw her again, not as a surprise, not as miracle, but as inevitability. She rode out of the horizon with the same calm gravity as before, her horse steady, her cloak carrying the hues of earth and sky. Another rider was with her, a man older, his face marked with years, but his gaze kind. They came with no caravan, no silver, no ceremony, only presence. Samuel stepped from the porch, his boots pressing deep into the snow, and met them halfway as if his heart had known the exact distance to walk. Tala dismounted, her eyes finding his with a steadiness that filled the empty spaces in him with quiet light. No words rushed. The silence held long enough to teach them both again what they already knew, that some bonds do not fray, that some crossings are not accidents, that some love stories are not written in declarations, but in the patient way two lives keep making room for one another. The older man watched, respectful, then spoke in a tone both formal and warm. "Some debts belong not to coin, but to spirit," he said. "When one carries another through a night, it is not only the body that is kept. It is also the memory of what it means to be human." His eyes softened on Samuel. "We came not to settle, but to share." He placed a small pouch in Samuel's hand. Inside were seeds, smooth and waiting, promise folded into their skin. "For your ground, so that what you keep may keep you." Samuel's throat tightened, his gratitude wordless, his hand closing around the gift as if it were a pulse. Later, when the sun dipped low and cast the plains in silver blue, Samuel and Tala sat together by the fire. The room did not feel small. It felt infinite, carrying their breaths, their silences, their laughter in tones too soft for anyone but them to hear. He told her how the yearling had grown stronger, how the hawk still circled the ridge, how the willow bark had eased the ache in his hand. She listened with the tenderness of someone who understood that even the smallest details were offerings. In return, she spoke of her people's songs, of stories sung low at night so the children would remember, of the old ones whose eyes carried light even when storms pressed hard. Their words twined like threads in a tapestry, not rushed, not tangled, each one placed where it belonged. When at last she rose to leave, the firelight held her as though unwilling to release its glow. Samuel stood, the cloak draped across his shoulders, and walked with her to the door. Outside, the air shimmered with stars, clear and innumerable, each one a witness. She placed her hand against his chest just once, a gesture as soft as prayer, and whispered, "Keep the night." He placed his hand over hers and answered, "And keep the day." The wind stirred then, gentle, carrying their words across the snow to join the ancient songs of the land. As her horse carried her away, his heart did not ache with loss. It pulsed with fullness, with the knowledge that what they had begun was not bound by distance or season. It was written now, in the fabric of their lives, woven into every ridge, every storm, every firelit silence that would come. He returned to his chair by the hearth, the seeds placed on the table, the cloak warming his shoulders, and felt within him not loneliness but belonging, to her, to the land, to the story they had created together. And if this story has carried warmth into your own heart, if it has reminded you that love can heal across distance and silence, that kindness keeps the night whole, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Leave a comment with what stirred you most. Let your voice add to this fire. If you felt comfort in these words, if you found even a little light here, I ask you gently to like this story, to subscribe so you may return when more tales are told, and to walk with me in keeping alive the healing power of love and memory. For stories like this live longer when carried together.